I asked when the wedding was. My daughter-in-law said, "We got married yesterday, just for special people." A week later, she called about the rent. The Sunday my son Deshaun got married, I was home on Pemberton Drive, pressing my church blouse and watching the 10 o'clock service on Channel 5 because my knee had been bothering me all week. I didn't know a wedding was happening. Nobody called me. Nobody sent a card. Nobody rang my doorbell. I found out because Deshaun's cousin Patrice posted a picture on Facebook at 11:17 in the morning. Deshaun in a gray suit, Brianna in a white lace dress, both of them smiling in front of a flower arch at the Memphis Botanic Garden, and the caption said, "Just witnessed two of my favorite people say I do. So blessed." I sat down on the edge of the ironing board stool and I read that caption 3 times. Then I called my son. He answered on the second ring, voice light and easy the way it always is when he hasn't done anything wrong in his own mind. "Hey, Mama," I said. "Deshaun, did you get married this morning?" A pause. Not a long one, just long enough. "Yeah, Mama. It was real small. Just a few people." I said, "I'm your mother." He said, "Brianna wanted it intimate." I said, "When you say a few people, who?" He listed 4 names. His best friend, Marcus, Marcus's wife, Brianna's sister, Brianna's college roommate. I said, "Deshaun, I am your mother. I carried you. I worked double shifts at First Tennessee Bank for 22 years so you could go to college without debt. I gave you and Brianna the downstairs unit of my Melrose Avenue duplex at no charge so you all could get on your feet. And you got married without me." Another pause. Then Brianna's voice came on. She must have been right there the whole time, listening. "Miss Maxine," she said, smooth as a river stone, "we just wanted something intimate, just special people." I heard what she said. I also heard what she didn't say. I told them congratulations. I told them I'd talk to Deshaun later. And I hung up the phone. 7 days after that phone call, Brianna called me back. Not to apologize, not to explain. She called because she wanted to talk about the duplex. Specifically, she said, about formalizing the arrangement. She'd done some research, she told me, on rental market rates in the 38104 zip code. She had some thoughts about tenant rights. She used the word equity 4 times in the first 2 minutes. I let her finish. Then I said, "Brianna, sweetheart, I was just about to call you about the very same thing. And that is where this story really begins. I need to tell you who I am before I tell you what I did, because context matters. Context is everything. My name is Maxine Ruth Carter. I turned 65 in March. I am 5'4", medium brown, with gray locks that I started growing when I retired and that now reach past my shoulders. I wear reading glasses with tortoiseshell frames that I bought from a boutique on South Main, and I own exactly 7 pairs of good shoes because I believe in investing in what carries you. My late mother, Celestia Ruth Jenkins, told me that when I was 9 years old, and I have never forgotten it. I grew up in Orange Mound, the oldest of 4 children. Me, Loretta, Damon, and baby Candace, who we lost to a car accident when she was 19 and who I still talk to sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch in the evenings. My father, James Jenkins, drove a city bus for 31 years. My mother cleaned other women's houses until her knees gave out, and then she took in ironing. They were proud people who never asked for anything they hadn't earned, and they raised us the same way. I graduated from Hamilton High School in 1979. I went to Lemoyne-Owen College on a partial scholarship and worked the front desk at a Holiday Inn to cover the rest. I got my degree in business administration in 1983 and walked into First Tennessee Bank 2 weeks later with my resume in a manila folder and asked to speak to the hiring manager. He was a white man named Gerald Hofstede who looked at me over his reading glasses like I'd asked him something amusing. I told him I typed 65 words per minute, I could operate any adding machine he had in that building, and I intended to stay until I was management. He hired me as a teller. I was branch manager at the Midtown location by 1997. I was senior branch manager, overseeing 3 locations by 2007. I retired in 2021 with a full pension, a 401k that my financial advisor says is very healthy, and a reputation in the Memphis banking community that I built one relationship at a time over nearly 4 decades. I was married to Raymond Carter for 19 years. Raymond was a good man, an electrician with his own small company, and a laugh that filled up a room. We had Deshaun in 1988 when I was 26. We were happy for most of those 19 years. Then Raymond got sick. Lymphoma, stage 3, diagnosed in 2002. And the years after that were hard in ways I don't have enough words to fully describe. He died in 2007, the same year I was promoted to senior manager. I wore black for a year, and then I decided Raymond would have hated that, so I stopped. Deshaun was 19 when his father died. He was at the University of Memphis on a partial athletic scholarship, track and field, and I watched him grieve and grow and stumble and right himself over the next 4 years in the way that young men do. He graduated in 2010 with a degree in marketing. He got a job at a mid-size advertising agency downtown. He found his footing. I was proud of him. I am still proud of him, of who he was and who he could be, and I hold those two things carefully, separately, even now. The duplex on Melrose Avenue was my investment property. I bought it in 2014 with money I had been saving since the late 90s through Raymond's illness and death and every hard year in between. It's a solid brick building, built in 1952, 2 units stacked, each with 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a good kitchen, and original hardwood floors that I had refinished the year I bought it. The upstairs tenant at the time was a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Eubanks, who had been there since 1989 and paid her $800 a month like clockwork on the first. She passed away in 2019, and her niece cleared out the apartment and gave me back the keys with a handwritten thank you note that I still have in my desk drawer. I was 57 when I bought that duplex. I was thinking about retirement income. I was thinking about the future. I was thinking about the kind of woman I wanted to be at 65, at 70, at 80. A woman who had built something, who was not dependent, who owned property in a city where Black women had always been told they couldn't. I was not thinking about my son's future wife. Deshaun met Brianna Holloway in 2020 during the pandemic through one of those apps. She was living in Nashville at the time, working in HR at a logistics company. She's 34 now, tall and pretty, with box braids she changes every 6 weeks and a wardrobe that is clearly expensive. She's smart. I'll give her that. She graduated from Tennessee State, and she uses that education precisely and deliberately, which I respect even when I don't respect the direction it's pointed. They dated long distance for a year, and then, in the fall of 2021, Deshaun told me they were serious and that Brianna was planning to move to Memphis. I was glad. I liked the idea of my son settling down. I liked the idea of eventually having grandchildren. I was cautiously optimistic, the way mothers are when their children bring someone home for the first time. What Deshaun told me next was that they were looking for an apartment in Memphis and that prices had gotten crazy. I said, well, the downstairs unit on Melrose just opened up. He said, Mama, I can't ask you that. I said, I'm offering. He said, what about rent? I said, get settled first. We'll talk about it later. That was October of 2021. Later never came. We never talked about it. They moved in on a Friday in November with a rented truck and 3 of Deshaun's friends, and I had cleaned the floors and put fresh shelf paper in the kitchen and left a vase of grocery store flowers on the kitchen table because I wanted her to feel welcome. 4.5 years, not $1 of rent. Not once did I bring it up because I was watching them and I genuinely thought that they were working towards something. That Deshaun would come to me one day and say, Mama, we're ready to start paying you. That the arrangement was temporary scaffolding, not a permanent structure. I understand now that I was wrong. I want to be fair to Brianna because fairness matters to me, and because I do not think she is a bad person. Exactly. I think she is a person who grew up believing that the world owed her certain accommodations, and who is very skilled at arranging other people's generosity to serve her own interests while framing it as something else entirely. The first time I had a feeling about her, just a small, quiet feeling in the back of my chest, was about 4 months after she moved in. Deshaun invited me to dinner, a Sunday meal, and when I arrived, Brianna answered the door. She was warm and pretty, and she gave me a hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time. And then she showed me around the apartment as though she were showing me a place she owned rather than a place I owned. She had redecorated. Not rearranged, redecorated. The walls were a different color. She'd painted them while I was on a trip to Atlanta to see Loretta. A muted sage green that I'll admit was tasteful, but I hadn't been asked. The light fixture in the dining room had been replaced with something from West Elm. There was a gallery wall in the hallway with prints I didn't recognize. I didn't say anything. They were making it their home, and that was fine. That was what I wanted. But something registered. Over the following months, I watched Brianna settle into that apartment the way water fills a container. Completely, comfortably, as though there had never been any question of who it belonged to. She started referring to it as our house, not our apartment. Our house. She hosted her friends there for brunches and told them, Deshawn tells me, that they were homeowners. Which is not true. They were not homeowners. I am the homeowner. She also had opinions about the upstairs unit, which I kept empty for a while after Mrs. Eubanks passed, because I was trying to decide whether to renovate before renting it again. Brianna mentioned once, in what she probably thought was a casual way, that it would be nice if they eventually had access to both units, for space, for storage, for a home office. She said she'd read that in some markets. Property owners structured things as family compounds. I said, that's interesting. I said nothing else. She was also, I noticed, very curious about my finances. Not in a direct way. Brianna is never direct about the things she actually wants to know. But she asked questions. She asked about my pension, framed as admiration for my career. She asked about the property tax on Melrose, framed as concern about my retirement budget. She asked about my other assets. I own my house on Pemberton outright, and I have the duplex and the retirement accounts, framed as wanting to understand the family's financial picture now that she was part of the family. I answered what I chose to answer and deflected the rest with the ease of a woman who spent 38 years negotiating with people who thought they were smarter than her. I mentioned all of this to my sister Loretta one evening on the phone. Loretta is 62, a retired school librarian, sharp as a tack, and she has never in her life sugarcoated anything for my benefit. She said, Maxine, that girl is calculating. I said, I know, she said. What are you going to do about it? I said, watch and wait and make sure my documents are in order. Loretta said, you have always been the smarter one. I said, the jury is still out on that. Deshawn, for his part, was genuinely happy. That is the most complicated part of all of this. My son was in love with this woman, and the love appeared to be real. He looked at her the way his father used to look at me, with a kind of full-body attention that I recognized and could not dismiss. When they laughed together, it was easy and unforced. He was softer with her than he had been with previous girlfriends, more attentive, more willing to be vulnerable. I loved my son. I did not want to damage something real in his life by warning him too directly about what I was observing in his wife. So I watched, and I waited. And I made sure my documents were in order. In the 2 years before they got married, Deshawn had mentioned marriage exactly once in my presence. In passing, in the way you mention something you've thought about but haven't decided yet. He said something like, we'll probably do something small when the time comes. I said I would love to be there for it. He said, of course. I believed him. That's on me. The signs were there in the spring before the wedding, looking back. Brianna mentioned to me once that she found big family events overwhelming. She said this at Easter dinner, at my house, at my table, with my sweet potato pie and my collard greens, surrounded by my family. She said it pleasantly, the way she says everything, with a small, apologetic smile that is designed to make you feel you'd be unkind to press. I said, well, some people are built that way. Nothing wrong with it. She said, I just think when people get married, it should be about the two of them, not about the production. I said, I can agree with that. I thought she was talking abstractly. About weddings in general, about the culture of excess and bridal registries and $500 a plate dinners. She was not talking abstractly. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. Memphis in June is hot and thick and beautiful in a way that I have always loved. The jasmine comes in hard and the evenings linger and the city feels alive in its bones. I remember that Saturday because I had been planning to go to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and then come home and finally plant the tomatoes I'd been putting off. I was pressing my church blouse. I went on Sunday and watching Channel 5, and Patrice posted that photo. The list of people at that wedding: Marcus Odom, Deshawn's best friend since the 6th grade, Marcus's wife, Tanya, Brianna's younger sister, Deja, Brianna's college roommate, a woman named Prentice, who I had met once at a Christmas party, the officiant, the photographer, 8 people in a rented arch at the Memphis Botanic Garden. I was not on that list. My brother Damon was not on that list. My sister Loretta was not on that list. Deshawn's Aunt Gloria, his father's sister, who helped raise him during the hard years of Raymond's illness, was not on that list. His cousins. His grandmother on the Carter side, who is 81 years old and made the gumbo at every family gathering for as long as anyone can remember. Not on that list. Just special people. When Deshaun told me Brianna wanted it intimate, I understood what he was saying. His wife had organized a wedding that excluded his entire family on her side of the equation and included exactly the people she approved of. And Deshaun, my son, who I raised to know better, had gone along with it. Had stood in front of an arch in the Memphis Botanic Garden and said vows without calling his mother the night before to at least warn her. I said congratulations. I said I'd talk to Deshaun later. What I did after I hung up was sit very still for about 10 minutes. I am not a dramatic woman. I don't throw things or scream or fall apart in visible ways. What I do is go quiet, real quiet, the kind of quiet that my mother used to call Maxine's thinking quiet. And I let the thing settle and take its shape, and then I figure out what to do about it. What I figured out, sitting in my kitchen with the iron still plugged in and the Channel 5 preacher talking in the background, was this. Brianna had decided that I was not a special person, and she had done it in a way that she probably thought was unchallengeable, because what was I going to do? Demand to retroactively attend a wedding that had already happened? But she had also, in the same move, made a miscalculation, because she had just clarified, with perfect clarity, exactly where she stood, not toward my son, toward me, and now I knew. And knowing, I no longer had to spend any energy wondering. I unplugged the iron. I called Loretta. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Lord have mercy, Maxine." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to wait for her to call me." Loretta said, "She'll call." I said, "Yes, she will." We were both right. 7 days later, I was in my garden. The tomatoes were finally in the ground when my phone rang. Brianna's name on the screen. I took off my gardening gloves and I sat down in the lawn chair under the pecan tree and I answered, "Miss Maxine, hey, I've been meaning to call." Her voice was bright and warm and pitched at exactly the register she uses when she wants something. I have studied this woman for 4 years and I know her vocal registers the way a banker knows a spreadsheet. "Brianna," I said, "congratulations again, sweetheart." "Thank you. It was just perfect, the way we wanted it." A brief pause. "I hope you understand. It was truly just about keeping it intimate." "I understand," I said, which was true, though not in the way she meant. "So," she said, "I actually wanted to talk to you about something, and I hope this is okay, because Deshaun and I have been talking about it, and we just want to make sure we're all on the same page." "Go ahead," I said. "So we've been at Melrose for, almost 4.5 years now, and we love it. We really do love being there, and we are so grateful for everything you've done for us." She paused in the way that people pause when they're about to pivot from the gratitude section to the actual point. "But we've been doing some research, just thinking about the future, about building equity and things like that. And we've been reading a little bit about tenant rights in Memphis, and we wanted to talk to you about maybe formalizing the arrangement." I said, "Formalizing?" "Right, like putting something in writing. Because right now it's kind of informal, and Deshaun and I were thinking. And this is just a thought, Miss Maxine. We're just talking. That it might make sense to look at what a formalized lease would look like, with market-appropriate terms." She said market-appropriate, the way people say words they learned from a website 2 days ago. I said, "What kind of market-appropriate terms did you have in mind?" "Well," she said, and I could hear her settling into her prepared notes. "We looked at comparable units in 38104, and the range is pretty wide. We saw some places listed as high as 1,800, which we know is higher than the market average, but even the average for a 2-bedroom in Midtown is around 1,200. So we were thinking, given the relationship and given the history of the arrangement, that something in the 800 to 900 range would be fair and would still represent real value for both sides." I let her finish. Then I said, "Brianna, let me make sure I understand. You're calling me 7 days after your wedding, a wedding that I was not invited to negotiate the rent on my property." A brief silence. Then, carefully, "I didn't realize you were still upset about the wedding." "I didn't say I was upset," I said. "I said I was not invited. Those are 2 different things." Another silence. I said, "Let me ask you something. This research you did on tenant rights, what specifically did you find? She started to say something about month-to-month tenancies and notice requirements, and I let her talk for about 30 more seconds, and then I said, "Brianna, I have an attorney. His name is Charles Odom, and I have had him on retainer since 2014 when I purchased that property. I know exactly what the law says about month-to-month tenancies in Shelby County. I know what notice is required. I know what is and is not a protected tenancy. And I know, because I have reviewed this in the past month, that Deshawn and Brianna Holloway Carter are not on any lease, have never paid any rent, have no written rental agreement, and have no legal status as tenants with any standing to dictate terms to me." The silence this time was longer. "Miss Maxine, I also know," I said, keeping my voice even and pleasant, the way I learned to do in 38 years of banking, that the market rate for a 2-bedroom unit in the 38104 zip code is not $800 to $900. It is $1,650. That's what the comparable units are actually renting for, Brianna, not the ones you pulled from the lower end of the range. She said, "We have been there 4.5 years. There's a history." "There is a history," I agreed. "The history is that I provided you and my son free housing for 4.5 years because I loved my son and I wanted you both to have a foundation. The history also includes a wedding last Saturday that did not include me or any member of my family. And the history now includes a phone call, 1 week later, in which you are attempting to negotiate a below-market lease on my property using tenant rights language you researched on the internet." Silence. "I have something to send to you," I said. "I'll be in touch." And I hung up the phone and sat under my pecan tree for a while, looking at the tomatoes in the ground, and I called Charles Odom. Charles Odom has been my attorney since 2001, when he helped me navigate a contract dispute with a contractor during a home renovation. And we have worked together on everything from Raymond's estate to the Melrose Avenue purchase to my retirement trust. He is 68 years old, plays golf badly, tells the same 3 jokes every time I see him, and is one of the most thorough legal minds I have ever encountered. I called him and explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate about Charles. When I finished, he said, "Well, Maxine, this is clear-cut on the legal side. No lease, no rent payments, no tenancy established under Tennessee law. They're guests. You can terminate the arrangement with proper notice." I said, "What's proper notice in this situation?" He said, 30 days, in writing, delivered in a way you can document." I said, "And if they don't leave?" He said, "Then we file for unlawful detainer and you get a court order. But let's try the notice first and see how they respond." I said, "Charles, I'm not trying to put my son on the street. I want to find a resolution that keeps a relationship intact if that's possible. What I'm not willing to do is be manipulated into a below-market lease by a woman who just excluded me from my own son's wedding." Charles said, "Understood. Here's what I'd recommend. 2 documents. First, a 30-day notice of change in tenancy status and initiation of month-to-month rental agreement, requiring a deposit of $1,650 and monthly rent of $1,650, effective 30 days from delivery. That's your legal position established. Second, a letter from you personally, not the attorney. That speaks to the relationship and offers a pathway to a different resolution if they want to discuss it." I said, "What kind of pathway?" He said, "That's your call, Maxine." But my experience is that a first notice with a second letter, giving them room to respond differently, tends to produce better results than a straight eviction notice, particularly when family is involved. I said, "Write the first document. I'll write the second one myself." He had the formal notice drafted and to me by the next morning. It was 3 pages, clean and precise, citing the relevant Tennessee statutes, establishing the legal status of the occupancy, and setting out the terms of the proposed month-to-month agreement. First and last month's deposit of $3,300, monthly rent of $1,650, utilities tenant paid, commencement date 30 days from delivery. I read it twice, made 1 small correction to the delivery address, and signed it. Then I sat down and wrote my own letter. I am going to share it with you because I spent a long time on it and because I think it says what needed to be said. It read, "Deshawn and Brianna, I am enclosing a formal notice from my attorney regarding the Melrose Avenue property. Please read it carefully and understand that it reflects my legal position, which is clear. I want to also say something to you directly, outside of the legal language. Deshawn, you are my son, and I love you without condition. That has not changed and will not change. I am not writing this letter to punish you, and I am not asking you to choose between your wife and your mother. What I am asking is that you see this clearly. For 4.5 years, I gave you and Brianna a home. I did not ask for rent. I did not set terms. I did not put pressure on your life or your relationship. I gave you space and time and a foundation because I love you and because I believed you were building towards something. Last Saturday, I found out from a Facebook post that you got married. I was not called. I was not warned. I was not invited. Your Aunt Gloria was not invited. Your grandmother was not invited. Your Uncle Damon was not invited. Your family, the people who have loved you and prayed for you and shown up for you your entire life, were not considered special enough to be present at the most important day of your life. 7 days later, your wife called me to negotiate the rent. I need you to sit with that sequence of events and understand what it tells me. I am not a resource. I am not a landlord to be negotiated with. I am not a variable in someone else's financial planning. I am your mother. And I have spent 65 years being a woman who does not accept being treated as less than who she is. The enclosed notice is my legal position, but I am also telling you this. If you want to come to me as my son, not as a tenant, not to negotiate terms, but as my son, to have an honest conversation about this family and about the future, I am here. My door is open. I love you, Deshawn. Mama. I put both documents in a large envelope. I drove to Melrose Avenue on a Wednesday morning when I knew Brianna was working from home. I could see her car in the driveway, and I rang the doorbell. She answered in leggings and an oversized Tennessee State t-shirt, hair wrapped, clearly not expecting me. The expression on her face when she saw the envelope in my hand was something I will not forget. I said, "Good morning, Brianna. This is for you and Deshawn. Please read everything carefully." She took the envelope. I said, "Have a good day." And I walked back to my car. Deshawn called me 45 minutes later. His voice was tight and careful, the way it gets when he is trying to manage his own emotions and project calm at the same time. "Mama, I got the letter." "I know you did," I said. "Can we talk?" "Of course." That's what the letter said. He came to Pemberton Drive that evening, alone. Brianna was not with him, which I noticed and which told me something. He sat down at my kitchen table and I put coffee in front of him the way I always do, and we looked at each other. He said, "I didn't know she was going to call you about the rent." I said, "But you knew about the conversation." He looked down at the coffee cup. "She mentioned she wanted to talk to you about formalizing things. I thought she just meant putting something in writing." I said, "At $900 a month." He closed his eyes briefly. "Mama." I said, "Deshawn, I want you to do something for me. I want you to imagine that I had planned your father's funeral and not invited you because I wanted it to be intimate. I want you to imagine that afterward I called you to ask about money." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not fair." I said, "Which part?" He didn't answer that. I said, "I'm not asking you to agree with everything I've done. I'm asking you to see clearly. You are a grown man and you made choices. Brianna is your wife and you chose her. I respect that. But you made those choices as if I were a resource to be managed rather than your mother, and that has to be acknowledged before anything else can move forward." He said, "I should have called you before the wedding. I should have at least called." I said, "Yes." He said, "I let her push on that too hard and I let her win, and I knew you would be hurt, and I just told myself you'd understand." I said, "What made you think I'd understand?" He said, very quietly, "Because you always do." I sat with that for a moment, because he was right and he was wrong at the same time, and I needed him to understand the difference. I said, "Deshawn, I understand things because I choose to understand them. Not because I have no feelings. Not because it doesn't hurt. Because I am your mother and I choose love. But that choice has limits. It has to. A person who accepts anything in the name of love ends up with nothing, and I will not be nothing. Not at 65 years old. Not ever." He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet. He is his father's son in the way he cries. He tries very hard not to, and his face does this particular thing, pulling tight at the jaw, and then a single tear escapes, and he wipes it like he's annoyed at himself. I handed him a napkin. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to be honest with your wife and with yourself about what happened. I need you to stop allowing her to position me as a transaction. And I need you to decide what kind of son you want to be. Not just when it's convenient, but going forward." He said, "And the house?" I said, "That's separate. The legal notice is the legal notice. Charles drafted it, and it stands. What happens next depends on how you and Brianna choose to respond." He said, "She's not going to like this." I said, "I know." He said, "She's going to say you're being vindictive." I said, "She's welcome to say whatever she likes. I am being clear. There's a difference." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "You can always ask me anything." He said, "Did you plan this? The notice? Before the wedding?" I said, "No, I planned it after. But I had thought about it before, if that's what you're really asking." He nodded. I said, "Deshawn, I am your mother. I raised you. I know you. And I have been watching this situation for 4 years, and I knew, not the exact shape of it, but I knew that the day would come when it would have to be clarified. I just didn't know it would come this way." He stayed for another hour. We talked about his father. We talked about the years after Raymond died, when it was just the two of us navigating grief and normal life at the same time, me working full days and coming home to a grieving teenager and trying to be both parents and still be myself. He had not forgotten those years, I could tell. They were sitting right behind his eyes. When he left, he hugged me at the door. A long hug, the kind he hasn't given me since he was small. And he said, "I love you, Mama." I said, "I love you too. That has never been in question." He nodded and walked to his car. I watched him go, and then I went inside and sat with Loretta on the phone for an hour, telling her everything. Loretta said, "Now the question is what Brianna does with it." I said, "Yes." She said, "You think she'll double down?" I said, "I think she'll try a few different approaches before she gets to where she needs to be." I was right about that too. She tried 3 different approaches over the following 2 weeks, and I am going to describe each one, not because I want to be unkind to her, but because understanding how people operate when they are backed into a corner is useful information, and maybe someone listening to this will recognize a pattern in their own life. The first approach was injured innocence. Brianna called me 3 days after Deshawn's visit. She was warm and soft-voiced, and she said she'd been thinking and praying, and she wanted me to know how sorry she was that I'd felt excluded from the wedding. She used the phrase "felt excluded" rather than "was excluded," which is a specific linguistic choice. She said she hoped I understood that she and Deshawn loved me, and she wanted us to have a beautiful relationship going forward. She said she hoped we could put the legal notice aside and talk as family. I said, "Brianna, I appreciate you calling. The notice was drafted by my attorney and reflects my legal position on the property. It is not something I can put aside. It exists, and it's in motion. But I am absolutely open to talking as family. What would you like to say?" She wasn't prepared for that. She had expected me to meet her softness with softness and agree to pause the legal process. When I didn't, she lost the thread of what she'd planned to say, and we had a somewhat circular conversation for 10 minutes that produced nothing concrete. Before she hung up, she said, "I just hope you know this isn't what I wanted." I said, "I believe you. But this is what happened." The second approach was through intermediaries. 4 days later, I got a call from Deshawn's cousin Patrice, the same Patrice who posted the wedding photo that told me my son had gotten married. Patrice is 29 and sweet-natured and completely over her head in what Brianna had sent her into. She hemmed and hawed for 5 minutes before she got to the point, which was that Brianna had apparently been talking to various family members and suggesting that I was threatening to evict Deshawn over the wedding, which was a characterization of events that was both inaccurate and precisely calibrated to make me look like the aggressor. I said, "Patrice, I love you." What I sent to Deshawn and Brianna was a legal notice about a property I own that they occupy without a lease and have never paid rent for. I also sent them a personal letter inviting a real conversation. That is the full truth of what I did. I would encourage you to ask your cousin directly for the documents if you want to understand the situation, because the documents speak for themselves. Patrice said, "Miss Maxine, I'm sorry she called me. I told her I didn't want to be in the middle." I said, "You don't have to be, but I appreciate you telling me." I also heard from Brianna's sister, Deja, one of the 4 guests at the wedding, you'll recall, who sent me a long text message about how Brianna had worked so hard to build a home and how I was disrupting their sense of security. I read the text carefully, acknowledged it, and did not respond to it substantively. Deja is not my family, and she does not have standing in this conversation. I heard from Marcus's wife, Tanya, who I actually like, and who had the decency to call me directly and say, "Miss Maxine, I just want you to know that me and Marcus aren't in the middle of this and we're not taking sides, and I hope it works out. I appreciated that. The third approach was negotiation, attempt 2. This time, Brianna called me and came prepared. She acknowledged, for the first time, that she understood why I might have been hurt by the wedding. She did not apologize. She said she understood why I might have been hurt, which is a different thing. But it was more than she'd offered before, and I noted it. Then she said she'd consulted with a friend who was a paralegal, and she wanted to discuss the notice terms. She thought the security deposit was steep. She thought the market rate figure was high compared to some of what she'd found. She wanted to propose a figure of $1,250 a month with a deposit of 1 month's rent. I let her finish her presentation. Then I said, "Brianna, I'm going to say something to you, and I need you to hear it clearly, because I'm only going to say it once." She said, "Okay," I said, "you are negotiating with me on the basis of what is financially convenient for you. I understand that impulse. I spent 38 years in banking, and I have sat across the table from thousands of people who were negotiating from exactly that position. It is a reasonable human instinct." I paused. "But that is not the conversation I need to have with you before any other conversation can happen. The conversation I need to have is about what happened 6 weeks ago, not what is convenient for your budget. And that conversation has not happened yet. You have apologized that I felt excluded. You have not acknowledged that you made a choice, a deliberate choice, to get married without my family present. That is a different thing." Silence. I said, "When you are ready to have that conversation, the real one, I'm here. Until then, the legal notice stands, and Charles will be in touch about next steps." She hung up without responding. The real conversation happened on a Sunday, 3 weeks after I delivered the envelope. Deshaun called me on a Saturday evening and asked if he and Brianna could come to Pemberton Drive the next day. I said yes. I made coffee, and I made a sweet potato pie because I always have something to feed people, and because whatever was happening, these were still my people. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Deshaun was quiet and steady. Brianna walked into my house differently than she had the last time. The last time was for Thanksgiving, and she'd been easy and confident and slightly territorial in that way she has. This time, she was contained. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she looked at me directly, which she doesn't always do. She said, "Miss Maxine, I owe you an apology." I waited. She said, "Not for how you felt, for what I did. I made the decision to have a wedding that didn't include you. I didn't want a big event, and I pushed for something small, and I let that be the reason, but it wasn't the whole reason." She paused and took a breath. "The truth is, I was. I was worried that if your family was there, it would become your family's event and not ours. I was afraid of being overshadowed, and that was not a good enough reason to do what I did, and I know it, and I'm sorry." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Thank you for saying that clearly." She said, "I know it doesn't fix it." I said, "No, but it starts the conversation." We talked for 2 hours. I told her things I had observed over 4 years, not as accusations, but as a witness, as someone who had been paying attention. I told her that I didn't think she was a bad person. I told her that I thought she was a person who was very good at getting what she wanted, and that this had probably served her well in many situations, and was serving her poorly in this one. I told her that I had no interest in being her adversary, but that I also had no interest in being used, and that the difference between a relationship and a transaction is that a relationship requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. She listened. Brianna, to her credit, is capable of listening when she decides to. She asked questions. She was not defensive in the way she had been on the phone. At one point, she said, "I think I've been threatened by you." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because Deshaun talks about you like you're the standard, the way you handled everything. After his dad died, the way you worked, the way you built things. He talks about you with so much respect, and I think I felt like I could never measure up to that, and so I tried to, I don't know, reduce you somehow." That was an honest thing to say, and I respected it. I said, "Brianna, I'm not a standard to measure up to. I'm a woman who made a lot of mistakes and worked very hard and lost her husband young and raised her son alone for a long time. I'm not a benchmark. I'm just Maxine." She looked at me and I saw something shift in her eyes. Not tears, but something releasing. Deshaun had been quiet through most of this, listening, occasionally putting his hand briefly on Brianna's arm. He looked tired and relieved at the same time. At the end of the 2 hours, I said, "Here's what I want to say about the property." They both looked at me. "I am not going to charge you $1,650 a month." That was the legal position, and it's accurate, and Charles will confirm it if you want to check. "But I am also not going to charge you $1,250 because that's below market and below what I believe the space is worth. And frankly, because accepting below market felt, in the context of everything, like being asked to pay for my own exclusion." Brianna flinched slightly at that. Good. I said, "I want to charge you $1,400 a month, first of the month, with a deposit of $1,400. That is a fair compromise. Below market enough to reflect the family relationship, and not so low that it asks me to absorb the cost of being undervalued. I want a proper lease drafted by Charles. 6-month terms with renewal options. And I want a conversation. Real, direct, not through intermediaries, whenever something needs to be discussed." Deshaun looked at Brianna. She looked back at him. She said, "That's fair." He said, "Yes, ma'am." I said, "One more thing." They waited. I said, "I want a celebration, not a redo of the wedding. Nothing like that. Just a family dinner, here, at my table, where we acknowledge that Deshaun Carter got married and his family gets to see him married. His Aunt Gloria, his grandmother, Loretta, Damon, the people who have loved him his whole life. One dinner. That's all." Brianna looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "When do you want to do it?" I said, "You tell me." She said, "Next month. I'll help cook." I looked at her steadily. She said, "I make a good green bean casserole." I said, "You can bring the green beans, Brianna. I'll handle the rest." And we all sat there for a moment at my kitchen table with the coffee going cold and the sweet potato pie between us, and something in the room was different from what it had been. Not fixed, not fully repaired, but different. Turned towards something instead of away from it. Deshaun said, "Thank you, Mama," I said. "Thank you for coming." The dinner happened on a Saturday in August. My sister Loretta drove up from Jackson with her husband, Harold. My brother Damon came with his wife, Cherise. Deshaun's Aunt Gloria, Raymond's sister, a woman who has never been anything but love in human form, came with her daughter and her daughter's fiancé. 3 of Deshaun's cousins. My neighbor, Miss Evadne, who has been feeding me and my business for 30 years and who I refuse to have any gathering without. 18 people at my dining room table and the overflow table I set up in the living room. I made the greens and the cornbread and the fried chicken and a peach cobbler. Loretta brought her deviled eggs. Cherise brought macaroni and cheese. Brianna brought the green bean casserole and she helped me set the tables and she put on an apron and did not complain once. After dinner, after the dishes were being done, Aunt Gloria took Brianna's hand and said, "Baby, I'm glad to finally meet Deshaun's wife properly." And Brianna, I was watching from across the room, held Gloria's hand with both of hers and said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm glad to be here." It was not a fairy tale ending. Things between me and Brianna are not easy, and I don't expect them to ever be completely easy. She is who she is, and I am who I am, and we will navigate each other for the rest of our shared lives with honesty and appropriate boundaries and occasional friction. That is real life. That is family. Deshaun paid the first month's rent and deposit on the 1st of September. He handed me a check. Not Brianna's check, his own check from his account. And he said, $1,400, Mama. First of many. I took it and I put it in my pocketbook and I said, "I'll have Charles send you the lease to sign." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He hugged me. Now. What do I want you to take from all of this? I want you to understand that your love is not a resource to be mined. Your generosity, your patience, your willingness to give without requiring anything in return, these are beautiful qualities, but they are yours. They belong to you. They are not a budget line item in someone else's financial plan. I want you to understand that clarity is not cruelty. Sending that legal notice was not cruel. It was clear. And clarity, real, documented, legal, honest clarity, is sometimes the most loving thing you can do in a situation that has been allowed to drift into ambiguity. The ambiguity was not serving anyone. Not me. Not Deshaun. Not even Brianna. I want you to understand that there is a difference between forgiving and forgetting, and you are not required to do both. I have forgiven Brianna for the wedding. I have not forgotten what it showed me about who she is and how she thinks. That knowledge lives in me now, and it informs how I engage with her, and there is nothing wrong with that. Wisdom earned is wisdom worth keeping. I want you to understand that 65 is not the end of anything. I see women my age who believe that the season for asserting themselves has passed, that it is now the time to be graceful and accommodating and to make peace with whatever they're given. I am telling you that is not true. I am telling you that 65 can be the clearest-eyed you have ever been. It can be the time when you have finally run out of patience for anything less than what you deserve. It can be the time when all of the experience and the loss and the hard-earned knowledge converges into a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she will and will not accept. That is what 65 feels like for me. I hope it feels that way for you too. I have a son who married a woman who is complicated, as all people are. I have a daughter-in-law who is learning, as all people must. I have a duplex on Melrose Avenue with a proper lease and market-adjacent rent and hardwood floors that I am proud of. I have a pecan tree in my backyard and tomatoes that finally made it into the ground and a sister who calls me every Sunday morning. I am Maxine Ruth Carter. I am 65 years old. I built everything I have with these two hands and with every lesson my mother ever taught me. And I am nobody's transaction. You remember that, baby. You remember that when the world tries to treat you like a line item in someone else's budget. You remember that love is real, and family is real, and your worth is real. And none of those things require you to give yourself away to prove it. That's all I have for you today. Walk in it.